Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, UN Security Council members scramble to salvage the Iran nuclear deal after U.S. President Donald Trump announced the U.S. will abandon the agreement. Could the deal work without the U.S.?
The United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang visits Japan as part of the efforts to rekindle good neighborly relations among the countries. What do better ties mean for both countries? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We start here with the Iran nuclear deal. Fulfilling a campaign promise, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced he is pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. In its place, he unveiled a new controversial pressure policy on Iran. He says Tehran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. The White House also wants Iran to freeze the development of ballistic missiles and to end its support for what the White House called terrorist groups in the region. The UN Security Council members and other countries who signed the nuclear deal were quick to respond to the announcement. Let's take a look.
Not a surprise. Calling it decaying and rotten, Mr. Trump announced the U.S. was withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Tehran says it's willing to see if the deal can be salvaged, but won't hesitate to restart uranium enrichment if that doesn't happen.
We will wait for some weeks, and we'll hold talks with our friends and allies and other signatories of the nuclear deal. Those who will remain loyal to the deal will talk. Everything depends on our national interests.
The U.S. would reimpose all previous sanctions and was warning Iran not to restart nuclear activities. All these actions go against the hope of other signatories. The EU and UN called on the international community to stick to the Iran nuclear deal.
The European Union will remain committed to the continued full and effective implementation of the nuclear deal.
The Secretary General calls on other JCPOA participants to abide fully by their respective commitments under the JCPOA and all other member states to support this agreement.
For its part, China says it will do its best to carry out and to safeguard the Iran nuclear deal.
China will maintain close talks with relevant parties objectively and fairly. It will also continue to implement and safeguard the JCPOA.
The nuclear deal was signed between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia, plus Germany. It ended 12 years of deadlock over Tehran's nuclear program. For nearly 3 years, all world powers except the US said the Iran deal is working and that Tehran is fulfilling its obligations. Now, it's in tatters. When it comes to a deal with Iran, Washington has chosen to be at odds with and isolated from the international community.
The U.S. has decided to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. So what is next? That is the big question. We are joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Li Keqiang, Director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Tehran, Iran, Professor Mohammad Marandi, the Dean of the World Faculty Studies with the University of Tehran. Welcome, Professor. In Brussels, Europe, we invited Peter Klepp, head of the Brussels office of Open Europe. Welcome. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Jonah Blank, senior political scientist from the RAND Cooperation. Welcome as well. Let me start with you, Professor Marandi. The decision by the White House to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Very briefly from you, what do you think is the next step?
Well, since the United States has discredited itself, it has violated the agreement, it has broken its promise to abide by its commitments. Of course, it wasn't abiding by its commitments even under the Obama administration, but it's all gone downhill much more swiftly under Trump. There are only one of two options. either the rest of the signatories, the European Union, the Russians, and the Chinese get together and make a decision to protect the deal from the United States and any threats that the United States may make against foreign companies, international banks, insurance companies, oil and gas companies, and so on and so forth. Either they make strong commitments, and this is especially true for the EU because they are the weakest link in this whole process, or the deal falls apart because the Iranians will not sit and abide by a deal which it does not benefit from.
Right. Mr. Klepp, coming from Europe, do you think the possibility Professor Morandi just mentioned, the very first one, that the other signatories of the Iran nuclear deal will be able to work together, particularly I'm talking about the European countries right now, be able to, even though having an ally of the United States, but act very differently this time?
Well, that's definitely their intention. They want to try to continue to implement the deal and to continue trade. Especially German companies have started to invest in Iran. So, but ultimately, I think they won't manage to stand up to the U.S. here, because if U.S. sanctions really bite, then as a European company, it won't be possible to have extensive trade with Iran. So ultimately, it's important that some renegotiation of the deal takes place now. I think that's the new reality. To the defense of Trump, if you look at the deal, it's not so obvious that this is the perfect deal. I mean, this was also acknowledged by German Chancellor Merkel. One of the problems is that Iran will at some point be able to develop nuclear capacity in a very short period, according to a few experts, even in a few days. Whereas before the deal, they needed at least 3 months, right? To give you an idea that, of course, it's good that there was a deal, but it's possible to improve it.
So it seems that there's already crippling of the commitment, at least according to Mr. Klepp. I'm not sure whether Mr. Klepp is that well connected to all the decision makers in the 3 European countries that we're talking about. But having said that, though, what about China, Mr. Li? The decision of going still along with the deal, even if the United States decided to punish those countries and companies, as Trump earlier claimed in his statement, against anyone that is still trying to work with Iran?
I think I personally believe China would work together with the European EU3 and also Russia, and to work out how the remaining parties of the JCPOA, to guarantee that how we can preserve instead of for a part that it is a very important agreement. And if the rest of the parties made its own determinations and also take some measures, China would go along with these parties.
Well, we'll see what countries are likely to do. We're going to discuss that a bit later. Now let me go to Mr. Blank, based in Washington, D.C. This is a political debate that has enormous amount of impact as a result of the decision made by the White House. First of all, relations with the allies. Secondly, the relations between his predecessor and him. Obviously, it is a demonstration of whatever Obama said yes, he would say no, as a result of his campaign promise. So here's the thing, Mr. Blank. Today, in the United States, enormous amount of voice of opposition. Of course, there are those who support President Trump as well. But where do you think the political debate is going as a result of this?
Right. Well, the consensus among Washington, D.C. experts and policy analysts is that this was a significant blunder because most people in the establishment view don't really see a strategy. However, there are two groups who are cheering for this. First are those who want a more comprehensive deal. President Obama and his supporters never portrayed this as a perfect deal, merely as the best deal that could be negotiated at the time. There are others who want to bring in Iranian support for groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen, as well as Assad in Syria, and other issues. Add to that supporters of Mr. Trump who see him as a master deal maker who can do better than Obama's team. The second group of supporters of the decision are those who don't want any deal at all, those who simply want to bring down the Islamic Republic of Iran and welcome in a successor regime. Most of the establishment, both Democratic and Republican, sees this as a huge error, but there are those who see this as a risky gambit that may pay off.
Well, former President of the United States, Barack Obama, did little to hide his disappointment over Mr. Trump's decision, of course. In a statement, he tried to point out 6 reasons why the withdrawal is misguided. Let's take a look at this. First, the deal was not just an agreement between the Obama administration and the Iranian government, but rather the United States and Iran. Secondly, the deal has worked in rolling back Iran's nuclear program. Third, the deal does not rely on trust. It's rooted in inspection and verification regime. Iran is complying with the deal does not expire, and so on and so forth. The deal was never intended to solve all problems with Iran. Of course, that's the deal under Obama administration being done. He would come out and support that. Having said that, though, Mr. Blank, what would that mean for the credibility? I think that is the bigger issue than the deal itself. Of the United States, you have the climate change issue earlier. Now you have another globally widely accepted Iranian nuclear deal, once again being brushed off easily by the Trump administration. And now the Trump administration is trying to work on the DPRK nuclear issue. So I guess the issue of credibility is still very important, even though mutual trust has never been there between Iran and the United States, or Iran or United States and DPRK.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and that is one of the key reasons that most analysts of Iran, whether they are Democratic analysts or Republican analysts, tend to see this as a big mistake, because it will have an impact on the ability of the United States to negotiate a deal with North Korea, to negotiate virtually any type of an agreement, when our negotiating partners will look at this and say, can it be trusted? Can the agreement forged by one administration be honored by the next? Every administration obviously has to make its own choices and starts from a clean slate in regard to things that are not treaties, but there is normally a continuity between one administration and another, and now that is somewhat called into question.
Mr. Li, since you're coming from China, I would also ask you about that, about the DPRK nuclear issue as a result of the impact, possibly, of the Iran nuclear deal, of the White House decision. Now, the 3 gentlemen coming from the United States, which were detained in DPRK, according to Mr. Trump's tweet, is on their way home. And Mr. Pompeo has already, on behalf of the White House, worked out the location and also the timing of this summit between DPRK and the United States. But the key question has not been resolved, Mr. Li. That is the content, whether there is any plan from both sides that can be accepted.
You know, I'm not going to predict what would be the final results of the very important talk between the United States and the DPRK. But I'm rather, afraid of the tactics using by the U.S. President, Mr. Trump, that, he wants to take everything off from the table by himself. It's kind of a theory that, the winner takes all, that he seems that he's the winner. He wants to take all, the benefits from the table without regard the other sides or his, the other parties, the own legitimate interests. That, I personally believe, would undermine, possibly, maybe there is prospect of good results, or there is something very positive from the negotiations.
When it comes to the deal, it is very important that all sides have to accept it. When it comes to the deal, it is very important that all sides' concerns, legitimate concerns at least, has to be taken into account. That's how a deal could happen. At least that is the tradition for hundreds of years. But having said that, though, let me come back to you, Professor Morandi, about what is next. Is Iran right now, Tehran, in discussion with the European capitals about the next stage of implementing the deal? If the Europeans, as Mr. Klepp earlier suggested, bow to the White House about the latter's decision eventually, what would Iran do?
Well, I think that if the Europeans bow to the United States and they do not take serious and concrete measures to assure Iran that they will prevent Trump from threatening European businessmen and women and industries, if they fail to do so, then Iran will withdraw from the agreement. I think there is absolutely no doubt that the Iranians will not renegotiate the agreement. Many people in Iran believe it's not a good deal. Many people thought that Iran gave way too many concessions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, after fierce debate, when it was decided that Iran would join up to the agreement, there was a consensus that once we've joined, we abide by the agreement. This is something that the United States has not done. And beyond the fact that Iran's defense capabilities and security depends on its missile defense capability, and Iran's national security depends on Iran supporting the Iraqi and Syrian governments from the extremists that the United States and its Saudi allies, among others, were supporting. Iran helped these countries prevent the black flags of the extremists from taking the capitals. It's in Iran's national interest. Besides these two realities, the very fact that the United States has not abided by its commitment shows that it cannot be trusted. We cannot negotiate anything with the United States because of the very fact that it's not abiding by its commitment. And one final point, with regards to Iran's nuclear program, just a few weeks ago, Pompeo, when he was the head of the CIA, he went to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he said when he wanted to become the Secretary of State, he admitted that the United States, that Iran, before the nuclear deal, was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. He was saying this because he wanted to say that if the U.S. pulls out, don't worry, Iran will not pursue a nuclear weapon, because Iran was not doing so before the nuclear deal. And unwittingly, he destroyed 15 years of anti-Iranian propaganda. So Iran, the Americans knew all along that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Yet it used this as a pressure point. And the Iranians know that they will continue to do different issues for the same thing.
Professor Morandi, if I could just follow up very briefly with you, and please answer briefly, Professor Morandi, that is, if Iran, as a result of other countries' reluctance to commit to the deal, this is not just the United States, but others as well, Iran withdraw from the deal as well, continue to develop nuclear weapons likely, then it is providing abundant excuses for the United States and its allies to start a possible military action toward Iran. Has Iran ever thought about that possibility and that direction? Professor Morandi.
Well, first of all, as I said, Iran has never been pursuing nuclear weapons. Pompeo, the head of the CIA, admitted that. So Iran has always worked within the framework of international law. Anyone can check the Pompeo quote. But beyond that, Iran has no other choice. Iran will not abide by a deal when the other side is not abiding by the deal. And the situation in the region and the world has changed. Iran is much more powerful today. Iran has many regional allies that it didn't have before. And the international community is witnessing that the United States is the violator of the agreement. So the whole situation has changed from what we saw years ago. The Iranian population sees the United States as the perpetrator of this problem.
Okay, we got some already perspectives coming from Iran. Mr. Klepp coming from Europe. Now we have quotes coming from the German industry saying the U.S. decision by the White House to withdraw is illegal. Meanwhile, you got foreign ministers coming from the 3 European countries that are trying to work out a possibility as to what's the next stage with Iran. So, Mr. Klepp, despite your personal view, what do you think, given the current circumstances, will be the next step for the European countries to work on together? Is it going to Washington once again? Or they have to think about what they can do alone rather than working with Washington?
Well, the renegotiation has started, like it or not, and indeed the Europeans will try to keep the deal as much as possible, and who knows, maybe Trump will in the end be much more flexible than it appears at the moment. We've seen that in other issues, but I think it's kind of hard to predict at the moment. Of course, as somebody said, it also depends on the situation in Iran, the position of the hardliners there, who also do not like the deal. But indeed, this is all up for negotiation. Now, one thing I want to correct, though, is this idea that Iran would not have been pursuing a nuclear weapon. I mean, we've seen these revelations by the Israeli Prime Minister, which made that very clear, and people dismissed it as old news. But
no, that's not true at all.
Our debate today is not whether Iran has a nuclear weapon or not. Our debate is about the Iran nuclear deal that the United States withdraw and what's going to be the impact of this. So, Mr. Klepp, if I could focus on, once again, on the topic for today, at least for today, that is, what is going to be the European countries' actions toward their own industry? Many of them are working with Iran. Many of them are also working with Iran's allies as well. So if the United States, according to President Trump, going to put sanctions on the European companies that are working with Iran, what are European capitals likely to do from your perspective? We are not discussing whether Iran had nuclear deal today, nuclear weapons today. That's another topic. We could put it for another day. But I want you to have your answer directly. Mr. Klepp.
In first instance, the EU capitals will try to postpone those US sanctions as much as possible. We've heard some different deadlines flying around. John Bolton and the US ambassador to Germany, they have all said that European companies should prepare to wind down their operations in Iran, but it's still unclear at the moment what the timeline for that will be. So I think that's a priority now, to sort of at least buy as much time as possible, and then indeed to try to keep as much from the deal as possible in place, and convince both the United States and Iran to agree with that. I think that's in a nutshell what European capitals will try to achieve.
I see. Thank you, sir. Meanwhile, Mr. Blank, we understand President Macron, for example, of France, is likely to visit the United States once again the coming week, very beginning of the week, some say. So you see the European counterparts are still trying to do their best. They're trying to bring Washington back on the board again. But will that work? What is likely to be the thing, you think, given your knowledge of the Trump administration, going to discuss with the European counterparts?
Well, I think there are two schools of thought, and it's up in the air which one wins. One school of thought is that the White House is just looking for anything that they can call a win, that it really doesn't matter whether it is substantive or not, as long as it's something that can be portrayed for the American domestic population politically as a win. That's all that matters. The other school of thought is that, no, we really have to bring down the Islamic Republic. And that's a very different set of priorities. So I think it's very much up in the air right now which way the White House will go. But I think that Professor Li made a very good point. There's no way that any deal can survive unless both sides or all sides see it as a win. So any deal that is seen by Iran as a loss is not going to be sustainable.
For now, I want to thank the four of you gentlemen for being with us and sharing your insights on this very important development regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. Li Guofu, Mohammed Marandi, Peter Klepp, and also Jonah Blank. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang on a mission to restore good neighborly ties with Japan. We will weigh in on improving relations between Beijing and Tokyo right after this break. You're watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is paying an official visit to Japan at the invitation of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He also attended the 7th China-Japan-South Korea leaders meeting. So what is the future of apparently warming relations between China and Japan after quite some time? And what is the significance of resuming the China-Japan and South Korea leaders meeting after 2.5 years? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is the first Chinese premier to set foot in Japan in 8 years, coinciding with the 40th anniversary this year of the signing of the China-Japan Treaty of Peace and Friendship. China and Japan held bilateral talks this afternoon. Li stressed China and Japan should firmly comply with the principles and consensus of the 4 political documents signed by both countries to bring bilateral ties back on the right track.
Recently, relations between China and Japan have improved and have stabilized. My visit to Japan is to get bilateral ties back to normal and make sure that our relations will continue to be healthy and stable.
Bilateral ties reached a low point in 2012 due to Tokyo's provocative moves on territorial and historical issues. The downward trend began to reverse itself in late 2014 when the two sides reached a 4-point agreement on handling relations. Last year, trade between the neighbors returned to above the $300 billion mark, while people-to-people exchanges rose to a record high of 10 million. Tokyo has also recently expressed its openness to the Beijing proposed Belt and Road Initiative.
This year is a milestone as it marks the 40th anniversary of the conclusion of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. We hope to make this year as a new start of Japan-China relations.
The bilateral meeting between China and Japan took place right after the China-Japan-South Korea leaders meeting. As Premier Li proposed, China, Japan, and the ROK should carry out joint projects through a new cooperation mode called the China-Japan ROK plus X. The 3 countries are at the forefront of development in Asia and should make full use of their respective advantages to jointly open the 4-party and even multi-party market to push the development of Asia.
For a discussion on the Chinese Premier's visit to Japan, we are joined in our Beijing studio Rong Ying, who is the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. Great to have you here. In Tokyo, Japan, we are joined by Takasato Watanabe, who is a Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. Professor, what a pleasure to see you too. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Rong. So, after a long time, finally the 2 countries got together, the prime ministers, while at the same time 3 countries, Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea, be able to talk to one another. What is likely to be the most concrete result, do you think, of these rounds of interactions?
Of course, the most important result is the very fact that finally, in 2.5 years, the 3 leaders sit together, the meeting, which is supposed to held annually on a regular basis. And the reason, of course, is known to all, is because the political relationship, in particular the 3 countries, not only China and Japan, but also China and South Korea, and South Korea and Japan.
Yes, it's very complicated for quite some years.
So far, the relationship shows, the meeting itself shows that finally the relationships have come back to normal.
But having said that, though, there are 2 things people are looking at. One is the economic issue, trade as well, among these 3 countries, between China and Japan particularly. The other thing is the DPRK nuclear issue. Remember, these 3 countries are all members of the 6-party talks earlier, and certainly their interests likely to have a direct impact on the final result. So on these 2 fronts, how much do you think the 3 will be able to work together? Which is likely to be easier for the 3 to work on?
Well, the trilateral cooperation, the idea started with, economic and trade, but gradually I think there's a realization that, after all, there's such an important cooperation mechanism. Has to take into account, has to consider the other issues, particularly peace and stability, security issues. North Korea's nuclear issues is one of the most important issues that for regional security.
Okay.
And the very fact that, of course, the easing of the tension, the meetings between the inter-Korean meetings, Korean summit, and more importantly, I think the coming meeting between North Korea and the United States looms large. So at the meeting, the three leaders came up with a statement to welcome the development, and more importantly, I think they agreed that how to pursue the settlement or resolution of these issues in a way. So I thought that was a very positive, I think,
development. Yes, Professor Watanabe, from Japan's perspective, what about trade? There is the free trade agreement that has been long discussed among the three countries, China, South Korea, and Japan. And yet, because of political reasons, being delayed and the quality of discussion not necessarily meeting the expectation, will it be able to come back on track? What kind of timetable, Professor Watanabe, shall we look at?
Japan, China, and South Korea, they have the very similar purpose to bring the peace and historical understanding these days gradually. However, we have another problem against North Korea. But economically, you see, those four countries can go hand in hand, and also they should go hand in hand. However, Japanese Prime Minister Abe, he had a very different understanding, or I dare say some ignorance about historical past. Now you see people, government, and also the state, country, should be organized together. However, in China, people's idea is different from the understanding of Japanese Prime Minister, who denies even a Nanjing massacre.
Yeah.
This is wrong.
Right.
So
it is wrong. It is wrong, but Professor Watanabe, if we could think about the fact that the three countries are already coming together, they are discussing. The question is, to what extent will they be able to discuss, and will they be able to achieve some kinds of mechanism regarding the free trade talks? Professor Watanabe, do you think there is a timeline that we should look at, or this is mainly still political difficulties is going to take the precedence of anything, even the three have got together?
For the economic development, I think to some extent, three countries can go hand in hand, because you see, besides a summit talking among three, we have, and also South Korean sent economic leaders. Practical, you see, level talkings are going on. So this doesn't produce any big problems, because they are economic circles people. But government must consider economic development together with the people's support. So I think this brings some delicate matter. And in addition, for the security of East Asia, North Korea is coming. So Mr. Abe wants to make the good success among three countries' summit talks, but it is not expected to be successful from the peoples and media in Japan.
I see.
This is frank view of myself and also the media people in Japan.
I see. Mr. Rong, however, we see new development. For example, China and Japan are talking about establishing a council, quite a formal mechanism of China-Japan dealing with the issues regarding earlier China's initiative about Belt and Road Initiative, meaning Japan and China has the possibility of working together in some ways regarding investing and working on infrastructure projects in other parts of the world. What do you make of that new development, Mr. Rong?
Indeed, this is a very positive development in terms of the bilateral relationship. And it also, I think, could become a new point of growth for China and Japan to pursue their economic trade relationship under the new circumstances. I think if you look at China, as we know that the China's economy is undergoing a kind of transformation, focusing more on quality, while Japan itself is also having difficulties, how to restructuring for that. So this is where China's initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, come into play, even though at the very beginning, for political reasons, the Abe administration had strong reservations on oppositions even. But gradually, I guess, pragmatism, prevail, and more importantly, the business community in Japan and realize that this is a good opportunity. This is where I think Japan and China and Japan can work together for the benefit of the relationship.
I see. But Mr. Rong, on the other hand, what about the trade issue? As I mentioned earlier to Mr. Watanabe, we see the free trade discussion should have started much earlier, and yet it finally did. On the other hand, the RCEP is also a topic being discussed by the three leaders. Between China and Japan, how far are we from seeing eye to eye about the issue?
Yeah, I think the trade issues is much more, complicated to some extent. That is, if we look at the logic of economy, and we have all the reason to believe that China and Japan, of course, plus South Korea, should work earlier, work out the agreement earlier for drawing for the FTA. But unfortunately, I think this is the part here that the politics that comes into play. If you look at Japan, I think while it is going working with China and South Korea on that FTA negotiation, it's also working with TPP and others. So I think from Japan, that this is a question, I think, which would come first. And more importantly, I think it is also related to so-called rulemakings. Now the Japanese have come to realize that, of course, they got that so-called CPTPP, but more importantly, I think come to realize that excluding China or is not going to work. And or in other way around, if I can say that Japan, if really want to make, have a say in the so-called rule-making and free trade and rule-based sort of trading system, multilateral system, you have to bring into China into play.
Well, Professor Watanabe, earlier you heard the Chinese guest, Mr. Rong, talk about several mechanisms, CPTPP and also RCEP, Free Trade Agreement, and as well as some of the other things Japan is looking at. What about the priorities? I'm sure Japan has to set a priority. How would that work for Japan? Mr. Watanabe.
For Japan, FTA is very important. And also, Japanese government and the economic circles here, they are confident in making the rather big agreements among three, China, Japan, and South Korea. This is not a big problem because in China, they are producing things that Japan cannot, produce, and vice versa. And Korea is a little behind, but their economy is not bad. So three countries can help with each other. This doesn't have the big problems, except the security problems. If North Korea comes in, the problems would be very much complicated. But as far as three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, practicality among three are in the same way. So I don't worry anything about this point.
All right. But Mr. Rong, it is not the first time that we see so-called breaking the ice. The relationship between China and Japan once cooled down, and eventually there is a time, or there was a time, that things are getting better. This is not the first time. This is not the second time. This is not the third time either. We see that repeatedly, periods of better relations and then cooling down. Very dramatic. So, Mr. Rong, what are we seeing right now? Is it likely to be a continuity, or this is likely once again to be repeated, the earlier, shall I say, sad and tragic trend of the bilateral relations?
I hope not. And I think that possibly this time will be different. First of all, as we all know that the relationship between China and Japan has undergone some changes in the sense that Japan has more or less come to the realization that China's rise is a reality. And dealing with a rising China is something I think Japan has to accept. And more importantly, I guess, Japan realized that the past few years, particularly during the Abe administration, that a stable relationship between with China serve its best interest. So I think if you look at the agreement between two leaders, you will find that they all agree that the political trust is important, principles that has been followed, but more importantly now they are also talking about how to explore practical cooperations and manage differences and conflict in a constructive way.
Okay, Ron Ying, Takasako Watanabe, what a pleasure to have both of you for being with us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.